They sized him up in an instant. Plain shirt, dark skin, cheap old bag at his side. Easy target. They didn't even bother hiding the smirks when he spoke about billions, treating every word like the punchline to a private joke. But behind that quiet stare was something they never saw coming. A plan precise enough to gut their empire in a single stroke, leaving them scrambling to explain how they lost everything to the man they called unqualified. This is the story of the meeting that ruined reputations, of arrogance undone by cold strategy, of a black visionary they tried to silence who held the power to destroy them with a sentence. If you're ready for a corporate thriller with real consequences, hit like, subscribe for the next chapters, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think they'll do when he takes everything back. Ellis Warren paused at the threshold of the vast glass-walled boardroom, fingers white-knuckled around the frayed strap of his battered laptop bag. The space was sterile and elegant, polished walnut table that seemed to go on forever, high-backed leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows casting the late-morning sun across a dozen tailored suits. He shifted his weight, feeling the cheap fabric of his khakis strain across his knees. His pale blue Oxford shirt was ironed but worn, the color faded from too many cycles in a laundromat. He took a breath that felt like swallowing dust. The second he stepped inside, the hum of quiet conversation dropped. Heads turned, brows rose. For a long, excruciating moment, there was only silence as Ellis walked, shoes scuffing softly against the polished floor. Greg Denner, the CFO, sat closest to the head of the table. His hair was slicked back with oily precision, a steel watch gleaming under the recessed lighting. He let out a low, piercing whistle that cut the silence. "Look at this," Greg said, drawing out each syllable, voice heavy with theatrical awe. Silicon Valley's savior shows up dressed like he's delivering pizza. A few people snorted. One of the junior VPs covered her mouth in polite horror, but her eyes gleamed with laughter. The general counsel turned slightly in his chair, smirking openly. Ellis's face went hot. He tried not to react. He pressed his lips together, forcing his feet to keep moving. He reached the end of the table, unclipping the old, squeaking buckle on his bag. His fingers trembled, but he hoped no one saw it. The room watched him with predator stillness. He cleared his throat. "Good morning. Thank you for taking the time to." Greg yawned with gross, deliberate flair, stretching back in his chair. "I'm sorry. Is there a real speaker coming after this?" The room erupted. Laughter crackled, bouncing off glass and polished metal. Ellis flinched at the noise, feeling it like slaps to his face. He heard one of them whisper, "I thought this was serious." Another, "Jesus, who let the intern in?" He tried again. His voice cracked once, then steadied. "I'd like to begin." Greg rolled his eyes so hard it was practically audible. "By all means," he drawled. "We're all dying to hear how you plan to blow $6 billion on Kumbaya nonsense." A rustle of muffled laughter followed. Ellis felt the words in his mouth turn to mud. But he had prepared for this. He had charts, forecasts, proof. He turned, connecting the HDMI cord with a small tremor in his fingers. The screen flickered to life behind him. The title slide was stark, unpolished, in big Arial font. The $5.9 billion Global Development Fund. He took a breath. This initiative represents a strategic opportunity to secure emerging markets while advancing sustainable infrastructure. I prepared projections demonstrating a conservative ROI of. He was cut off by a loud, mocking cough from halfway down the table. "Bless you," someone stage whispered, sending another round of stifled giggles. Ellis blinked rapidly, trying to focus on his slides. Bullet points blurred. He wiped his palm on his khakis, feeling the damp stick. "As I was saying," he pushed on, voice flat and forced. "We can deploy the fund over 3 phases. Oh, look," Greg interrupted, leaning forward as if fascinated. "Phases. He's thought it through, guys." The sarcasm dripped like acid. A VP chuckled. Someone else clapped softly, slow, and mocking. Ellis's mouth worked soundlessly for a second before he found his voice. "We've run models," he managed. "Conservative, moderate, aggressive. All show positive returns by year 2. Greg clicked his pen slowly, rhythmically, and the whole room watched it. He didn't bother to look at Ellis. "We don't invest in fairy tales," he said without raising his voice. "Sit down." Silence fell like a guillotine. Ellis didn't move. His mouth was dry. He swallowed and tried again. "If I could just sit down," Greg repeated. He met Ellis's eyes now, and his were cold, flat, utterly certain of victory. Ellis's knees wobbled. He clutched the edge of a table. The CEO, David Marks, cleared his throat uncomfortably but didn't intervene. Nobody did. Ellis's lips trembled once before he forced them still. Slowly, with all the dignity he could muster, he began to power down his laptop. It felt like the longest minute of his life. He could hear them whispering as he moved. "Look at him. Jesus. So sad." The cord tangled, and he had to yank it loose. He forced himself not to swear, not to cry. He straightened, wiped the dampness from his eyes with the edge of his sleeve, and forced his mouth into a flat line. He turned his head enough to catch his own reflection in the darkened glass panel beside the door. His hair was mussed from the humidity in the corridor, the old Oxford shirt rumpled from sweat and movement, the fabric at the collar permanently faded. He hated how small he looked. He drew in a breath that rattled in his lungs, pushed the door open, and re-entered. Inside, the mood had shifted from vicious amusement to smug boredom. The projector screen was now blank, his slides minimized on the communal laptop someone else had already claimed. The table buzzed with side conversations about sales targets and quarterly bonuses. But as the door closed behind Ellis, the noise hushed like animals scenting blood. He moved quietly to the corner of the room, away from the head of the table. No one invited him to sit. Instead, they tracked him with eyes that didn't even pretend to hide contempt. Greg Denner cleared his throat, snapping his expensive pen shut with a single loud click. "Well," he said slowly, savoring the word like a sip of good scotch. "Since the genius is back, I suppose we should do him the courtesy of finishing his little Q&A." He spread his hands mock innocently. "Anyone have questions?" A thin-lipped director named Marissa Taylor glanced at Ellis with a look that might have been pity if not for the condescension radiating from her voice. "Ellis," she began in syrupy tones, leaning forward with interlaced fingers, "it's cute that you want to save the world, but can you even handle the scale?" She drew out the word "this" with venomous precision, stabbing the air with her index finger as though pointing at a particularly stupid child's drawing. Ellis felt a flush crawl up his neck again. He tried to clear his throat discreetly, but it came out as a choke. He forced himself to speak. "We have a phased deployment plan," he began, voice cracking, "and experienced partners in international infrastructure. It's not charity, it's strategic." Greg held up a finger, cutting him off. "Whoa, whoa," he said, drawing a laugh from the table. "You've got partners? Really? Who? Craigslist contractors? Some third-world NGO that can't keep the lights on?" Ellis opened his mouth, but Greg kept going, eyes twinkling maliciously. "Or did you mean your friends from business school? Oh wait, I forgot, you didn't go to business school, did you?" The laughter was louder this time. Ellis felt something tear inside. He bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste blood. He inhaled shakily. "If I could just finish," he managed. Another voice interrupted, calm but scathing. It was Peter Lang, one of the more senior directors, who hadn't spoken yet, his expression icy and superior. "Ellis, listen," he said with heavy, feigned patience. "This is big money, adult money. We're not handing you a lemonade stand. Why don't you take a break outside? We'll finish the real work." The words hung in the air with the finality of a judge's gavel. Ellis blinked rapidly. The room swam. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was dry as desert sand. I'm supposed to answer questions," he croaked. Greg made a sympathetic face that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, buddy," he said, voice dropping to a mock gentle whisper. "You tried, really, but you're out of your depth. Go catch your breath. We've got actual numbers to review." Ellis felt the sting behind his eyes again. He fought it down, cheeks twitching with the effort to keep from sobbing. He wanted to scream that he'd spent 6 months building this plan, that he'd given up sleep, health, time with the few people who still liked him, that it wasn't some childish dream. Instead, he stared at the polished tabletop, the reflections of their sneering faces in the glass. He couldn't make himself speak. David Marks, the CEO, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, eyes flicking away like a man who didn't want to see a car crash he was complicit in. He tapped his tablet. "Okay," he said in a tone meant to be soothing but came out dismissive. "Let's just take a quick 5. All right? Ellis, maybe grab a coffee." Ellis tried to find words. He really did. But they didn't come. His mouth trembled. He gave up. He turned slowly, heart hammering like it would punch through his ribs, and walked to the door with wooden steps. As his hand closed around the handle, Greg's voice followed him. "Ellis," he called lightly, like a friend sharing a joke. Ellis hesitated. He turned halfway, eyes wet and angry and hopeless. Greg smirked. "Make sure it's decaf. Don't need you too wired to dream up the next billion-dollar bedtime story." The laughter this time was thunderous. It filled the room, spilling over itself like waves crashing on rocks. Ellis didn't answer. He didn't nod. He turned back, opened the door, and stepped out. The laughter was still rolling as the door clicked shut behind him, muffled but unmistakable. Forecasts with triple-check data. A $5.9 billion plan that could redefine the company's global standing. He reminded himself that his plan made sense, that it deserved to be heard. When he felt the tears had dried and the tremor in his chin had faded enough to hide, he pushed the door open again and walked back in, shoulders tense, face white with emotion. Inside, the room was in full, easy conversation. Greg Denner was half standing, leaning over to show something on his phone to Marissa Taylor, who was snickering behind her hand. Peter Lang was jotting notes on his legal pad with slow, deliberate strokes. David Marks sat at the head of the table, his expression studiedly neutral as he scrolled through his tablet. The laughter dimmed but didn't die when Ellis re-entered. Greg didn't even bother sitting back down. He stayed in his semi-crouch, one eyebrow raised in faux surprise. "Look who's back," he said, voice bright with cruelty. "Guess the grown-ups meeting wasn't over after all." Ellis didn't answer. He set his bag down carefully on the floor next to a chair he wasn't invited to sit in and turned on his heel to face them. His heart was a hammer, but he forced the words out, calm and tight. "I'd like to continue presenting the revised deployment schedule," he said. "This phase has staggered risk exposure, front-loaded legal compliance, and established partnerships. I believe this is what the board asked for." For a moment there was silence, and in that second Ellis let himself hope. But then Greg straightened up and clapped his hands together once in slow, theatrical applause. "Listen to that, folks," he said. "He believes. Adorable." Marissa snorted, covering her mouth. Peter didn't even bother to look up. Ellis swallowed, feeling his face flush hot. He glanced at David Marks. The CEO didn't meet his eyes, just kept scrolling, pretending not to hear any of it. Ellis's voice wavered only once as he continued. "This model leverages green bond frameworks to reduce debt pressure while providing a minimum projected IRR of 11% over 24 months. It's a conservative approach with options to expand." Bang. The sound shocked him into silence. David Marks had slammed his palm flat against the table. The force sent a ripple through the water glasses lined neatly on the surface. The room froze. David looked up slowly, his expression finally breaking from that bored, polite neutrality into something colder. "Enough," he said, voice low but slicing through the hush. "We're done. We are not wasting time on your pipe dream." Ellis felt like he'd been slapped. His mouth worked for a second, soundless. He tried to gather his thoughts, anything he could say to justify the months of work he'd poured in, the late nights, the endless revisions. But David didn't give him the chance. "I'm serious," David continued, leaning forward. "You've had your chance. You've shown us your slides. You've made your little speech. It's over." Ellis's chest heaved. He could hear blood roaring in his ears. His fingers twitched at his side. He tried one more time, voice breaking. "If I could just clarify the debt ratio targets." Greg laughed outright. "Clarify? Ellis, there's nothing to clarify. You're playing pretend with real money." Peter finally looked up from his notes, blinking slowly. "Why is he still standing?" he asked in the bored tone of someone discussing a broken office chair. "Seriously, this is embarrassing." David sighed and shook his head, then looked at Ellis like he was something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "Sit. In the back." Ellis blinked. "What?" David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority was absolute. "Sit in the back corner. Now, we have actual work to do." Ellis felt the room tilt around him. For a second, he thought he might collapse. He swallowed, throat clicking, and looked around. No one would meet his eyes. Marissa gave a tiny shake of her head and mouthed, "Just do it." Ellis's chest ached. His vision wavered. But he moved. Each step felt like he was sinking into mud. He picked up his bag with numb fingers and trudged to the corner of the room, where a single chair sat against the wall, half in shadow. He lowered himself onto it slowly, eyes fixed on the floor. The chatter picked back up almost instantly. Greg cleared his throat and slapped a new set of papers onto the table. "Now let's talk real strategy," he said. "Expansion in the domestic market, with actual numbers behind it. Something we can bank on, not some half-baked humanitarian vanity project." Peter smirked. Finally, Marissa chimed in, voice smooth as glass. "I'm glad we're back to real work." No one looked at Ellis again. He sat in the shadows, back pressed against the wall, bag on his lap, hands folded so tight his knuckles were white. He felt like a child in detention, banished from the adults' conversation. The heat burned behind his eyes, but he forced it down. He wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. But inside he felt something crack. He listened as they picked apart other plans, praised half-baked ideas because they'd come from the right mouths, threw money around in theoretical bets without a second thought. They didn't need his plan. They didn't want it. They didn't want him. He listened as Greg Denner walked them through domestic expansion strategies with his casual arrogance, words sliding out like silk over poison. He heard Marissa Taylor suggest pivoting budget allocations into more realistic marketing initiatives, while deliberately turning her head away from him so she wouldn't have to see him. David Marks, the CEO, offered mild nods, giving them all the illusion of due diligence while his eyes skimmed his tablet. Ellis felt like he was in a fishbowl, drowning while they tapped the glass, bored. But then something shifted. Greg straightened and set his pen down with a loud click. He looked at David and tilted his head, voice pitched loud enough to carry clearly across the silent table. "Hey," he said slowly, a grin curling at the edges of his mouth. "You know what would be fun? Why don't we bring in the junior associates?" David blinked. "What for?" Greg let out a theatrical sigh, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Training," he said, drawing out the word. "We're supposed to mentor them, remember? Let them see how big boy strategy is done." Plus, his eyes flicked to Ellis, narrowing slightly, the grin sharpening like a blade. It'd be educational to see why certain ideas don't work. A few of them laughed at that. Peter Lang actually smiled for the first time in an hour, slow and mean. Ellis felt ice settle in his chest. He sat up a little straighter, heart hammering, but no words came out. David gave a tiny, dismissive shrug. "Fine, bring them in." Greg didn't even bother hiding his delight as he pressed the button on the conference room phone. He told the assistant outside to send in the group. Ellis could only sit and watch, stomach churning, as the door swung open a minute later and 5 younger employees shuffled in, looking nervous but trying to appear confident. They wore cheaper suits than the directors, but still far better than Ellis's wrinkled shirt and old khakis. They glanced around the room, eyes widening slightly at the tension in the air. "Come on in, don't be shy," Greg crooned, waving them forward with exaggerated warmth. "We're having a little masterclass." One of the juniors smiled hesitantly. Another swallowed hard. Ellis wanted to get up and walk out. He could feel his body trying to stand, but it was like his limbs had gone numb. His fingers dug harder into the strap of his bag, locking himself in place. Greg spread his arms. "Okay," he said, voice bright. "Today's topic is strategic planning, real-world applications." And also, he turned deliberately toward Ellis in the corner. Why some strategies are, let's say, less feasible than others. A ripple of awkwardness went through the junior staff. They all turned to look at Ellis, then quickly away. Greg clapped once, startling them. "Let's start with Mr. Warren's proposal," he said. "Ellis, why don't you walk them through it again?" In simple words this time. Ellis blinked. He tried to speak, but the words didn't come. He felt his throat tighten, a whine threatening to break out if he tried to force sound past it. Greg's grin widened. "No, cat got your tongue." Marissa sked, shaking her head slowly. "Shame. It really is cute, the idea of saving the world. But this is business." One of the juniors cleared his throat nervously. Wasn't this about a $5.9 billion initiative?" Greg snorted. "That's right, $5.9 billion. For what? For playing social worker." He rolled his eyes. "You think our shareholders want a charity case?" Another junior winced. Peter Lang leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Ellis, you even know how to spell billion." That one detonated like a bomb. The laughter exploded around the table. Greg actually slapped the polished wood, head thrown back, cackling. Marissa covered her mouth with both hands, but couldn't hide the giggles shaking her shoulders. Even David didn't stop it. He just looked down at his tablet, lips pursed in something like annoyance at the noise, but no attempt to intervene. Ellis felt his cheeks burn, so hot he thought the skin might peel away. He kept his eyes locked on the floor, because he knew if he looked up and met any of their eyes, he would break completely. He heard one of the juniors mutter under his breath, "Jesus," like he was embarrassed to be there. Another one shuffled from foot to foot, stealing glances at Ellis with that particular kind of pity that felt even worse than scorn. Greg finally calmed himself enough to speak. "In all seriousness," he said, wiping the corners of his eyes, "this is a lesson for you all. Ambition is great, but you have to know your place. You can't just dream up magic numbers and expect real companies to throw cash at you." Marissa added smoothly, "It's important to understand risk management, like not betting the company on utopian fantasies." Peter didn't say anything else, just smirked, watching Ellis like a cat watching a wounded mouse try to crawl away. Ellis tried to speak. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. His voice was a croak, not even loud enough to reach the middle of the table. "It's not charity." Greg leaned forward, cupping a hand behind his ear theatrically. "What was that?" "Couldn't hear you, buddy." Ellis's mouth worked soundlessly. He felt tears prick at the edges of his eyes and blinked hard, forcing them back, knowing if even one escaped it would be over. Marissa looked at the juniors with a calm smile. "See? Lesson number 1. Presentation is everything. Even if you have a plan, which, let's be honest, he doesn't, no one will take you seriously if you can't defend it." Another round of laughter. The junior staff had shuffled out of the room awkwardly after the teaching moment, their eyes darting between the directors and Ellis, as though they weren't sure whether to apologize or just pretend he wasn't a real person. No one said a word to him. They avoided his gaze as they left, the door hissing shut behind them. Ellis felt a heat behind his eyes, but forced it back. He swallowed hard, the taste metallic and foul. He just sat there while they dissected his plan like carrion, picked it apart for sport, turned it into a cautionary tale for people not to dream above their station. He had felt his voice fail him, had felt the humiliating crack in it when he tried to answer, the dry rasp that couldn't fill the room or silence the laughter. It had been worse than every boardroom microaggression he'd ever faced, worse than the underhanded jokes and polite snubs. This had been a bloodletting, but now it was quiet, too quiet. He lifted his eyes just enough to see David Marks, the CEO, tap the table lightly with his fingers. It was a dismissive, distracted motion that nonetheless silenced the side talk immediately. David didn't look at Ellis, not once. He kept his gaze on the room as he spoke. "All right, let's deal with the budget allocations." Ellis's heart skipped. He straightened up slightly, still seated, pressing his back harder to the wall. Budget allocations meant the fund. His fund. Greg glanced at David, eyes gleaming. "We still have the $5.9 billion from the Global Development Fund proposal to assign." Ellis opened his mouth. I'd like to speak about that, but Greg just spoke over him, voice rising slightly to drown him out. I propose we split it between core domestic assets and the infrastructure expansion in the West Coast corridor. Peter Lang nodded thoughtfully, as if the plan were novel instead of premeditated. Solid, real growth, real profit. Ellis heard himself. Please, I'm not finished presenting. I have the updated risk models. Greg didn't even turn to look at him. Second the motion, he said loudly, ignoring the rising panic in Ellis's voice. Marissa raised her hand delicately. All in favor? David nodded once, cold and final. Ellis felt his heart plummet. Wait. You can't just vote without even reviewing. Greg finally turned, twisting in his chair with slow, deliberate menace. He didn't bother to hide the contempt on his face. We just did. Ellis's mouth opened, closed. He heard a buzzing in his ears. Greg's voice went quiet, intimate, cruel. Do you want to know why? It's because we don't trust you with adult money. The words hit like a physical slap. Ellis recoiled as if struck, his hands shaking so badly his bag nearly slid from his lap. He sucked in a breath, a trembling hiss, willing his body not to flinch any further. Greg turned back to the table, ignoring him now completely. Motion passed, he announced with bright, false cheer. Recorded in the minutes. Marissa already had her phone out, thumbs moving with precise efficiency. Drafting the press release, she said airily. We'll want to get ahead of this. Spin it as prioritizing realistic projects, smart investment strategies. No mention of, she didn't finish the sentence. She just waved a dismissive hand in Ellis's direction. Ellis felt his chest compress. No mention of me, he whispered. Greg snickered. Oh, you're still here? Peter added without looking up. Don't be dramatic. It's not personal. It's business. Ellis's voice cracked when he tried to answer. This is theft. Greg spread his hands wide, mock innocent. Oh, is it? Because I'm pretty sure you don't actually control the money. It's company money. Our decision. Ellis's jaw trembled. He couldn't stop it. His teeth clicked together when he tried to steady it. It's my plan, he managed, voice high and strangled. David finally looked up, gaze heavy with bureaucratic boredom. Not anymore, he said simply. Marissa, how's that release coming? Drafted, she said sweetly. She read aloud with relish, eyes skimming her phone. The board of directors has unanimously decided to reprioritize funds from speculative international ventures into robust domestic assets, ensuring shareholder value through pragmatic, sustainable investment. Peter raised an eyebrow. That's good. Clean. Doesn't mention the clown show. Ellis shot to his feet. The chair scraped back with an awful screech. Stop it, he croaked. His vision swam. He couldn't even see their faces clearly through the blur. Stop this. I worked for this. This is real. It will work. They discussed budget reallocation like they were moving monopoly money around a board, praising each other's pragmatism and maturity for killing his plan and spreading the funds across their pet projects. No one addressed him. They had simply erased him from the conversation entirely. He might as well have been another piece of furniture, one they resented for taking up space. Ellis could feel the humiliation like a physical weight pressing him into the chair, making it hard to breathe. He kept his eyes on the floor so they wouldn't see them shining with unshed tears. The words they'd thrown at him still rang in his ears: pipe dream, charity case, child, not adult money. Every insult burned like acid in his memory, each laugh a blade that had stripped another layer of dignity from him. His mouth tasted of metal, his tongue dry and clumsy behind his teeth. He swallowed, but it felt like trying to choke down gravel. David Marks finally tapped the table and declared, I think that wraps it up. Papers rustled. Chairs creaked. Laptops closed with polite little clicks. A few of them chatted quietly about dinner reservations or upcoming golf games, already turning the page on the day's business. Ellis forced himself to stand slowly, every muscle trembling with rage and shame he couldn't voice. He tightened his grip on the laptop bag like it might keep him from shattering completely, fingers whitening on the strap. He took one deep breath to steady himself and walked toward the door. His scuffed shoes made dull sounds on the polished floor, mocking him with every step. He was almost there, almost free, when Greg Denner shifted in his chair and extended one well-shod foot into Ellis's path, blocking him just enough to make him stop. Ellis froze. The room quieted just slightly, an eager hush like the collective intake of breath before the punchline of a joke. Greg looked up at him with that cold, delighted malice that had lived in his eyes all day. "Whoa there," Greg drawled, leaning back in his chair like a king on a throne. "Running off so soon?" Ellis swallowed hard. "I'm leaving," he said quietly, the words dry and lifeless. Greg's grin sharpened. "Don't go yet. I want to hear it again. Tell us about your little charity plan." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, some of it half-suppressed, most of it gleefully unfiltered now that the vote was done and the press release sent. Marissa Taylor rested her chin on her hand, watching with the idle curiosity of a cat watching a pinned insect twitch. Peter Lang didn't even bother hiding his smirk as he flipped his notebook shut. Ellis felt his face flame hot, the burn reaching his ears. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His voice had abandoned him completely. Greg tilted his head, still grinning. "Come on, man. Don't be shy. Tell us how you were going to save the world with our money. Make us feel guilty for killing the dream." More laughter. Ellis couldn't look at them. He dropped his gaze to the floor, cheeks hot enough to blister. He felt his fingers dig into the laptop bag until they hurt. His mouth worked, but no words had come. He tried to breathe, but it sounded like a choke. Greg made a show of sighing, putting a hand to his chest in mock sympathy. "Ah, did we hurt your feelings?" Ellis pushed forward, brushing past Greg's chair with enough force to make it scrape back slightly. Greg didn't stop him again, but he laughed, high and triumphant. "Careful, big man," he called after him. "Don't forget to take your coloring book of slides with you." The room roared with laughter one last time as Ellis yanked open the door. The bright hallway lights spilled in, making the darkened conference room feel even more like a pit. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He let the door swing shut behind him, the muffled laughter dying as it clicked closed, leaving him in the too bright silence of the hall. He stood there, heart pounding, so hard he thought it might burst, vision swimming. He sucked in a shaking breath and exhaled slowly, trying to calm himself. But his hands were trembling so badly he nearly dropped his bag. He blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall where anyone could see. He started walking, shoes squeaking on the waxed floor with every uneven step. The corridor seemed endless, sterile, mocking in its corporate gleam. He felt like every glass wall and chrome fixture was watching him, reflecting his defeat back at him 100-fold. It repeated like a mocking chant, sour bile rising in his throat with every repetition. He kept moving, forcing his feet forward down the glossy corporate hall, not daring to look back. Each step felt like it might buckle, but he made himself keep going, pushing through the rotating glass doors with a heavy shove that rattled in the frame. He emerged into the cavernous lobby, the marble floors shining in cold reflection, the receptionist glancing up with bored disinterest. No one here knew what had just happened upstairs. No one cared. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish, an antiseptic scent that made him want to scream. He walked past a row of sleek black chairs, past a cluster of gleaming planters, until he reached a shadowed corner where the security camera wouldn't see his face clearly. He dropped his bag onto the floor with a thud that seemed too loud in the empty space. His fingers fumbled with the zipper. They shook so hard he had to try twice to get it open. Inside was his battered old laptop, stickers half-peeled and corners dented from too many years of being shoved into overhead bins and back seats. He sat on the cold marble floor back against the wall, legs splayed out in front of him like a broken puppet. He booted the machine. The fan made a pathetic wheeze as it started, the screen flickering with age. Ellis wiped his palm on his thigh to get rid of the sweat before touching the trackpad. He could see his reflection in the glossy black screen before it blinked to life. Eyes swollen and red, hair mussed, shirt wrinkled and stained with sweat at the collar. He remembered Greg's smirk, the way he blocked the door, his voice so mocking and triumphant. "Tell us about your little charity plan." The memory made his fingers tighten, joints popping as he clenched his hand into a fist. He wanted to punch the wall, scream. But he didn't. Instead, he forced his eyes onto the screen. He opened his encrypted vault, typing each character of the password slowly to keep his hands from slipping. He heard the laughter from the boardroom again in his head, overlapping with the echo of Greg's final words in the hall. He needed the lesson. Ellis's lip curled without humor. They wanted him to learn his place. They thought they'd taught him something today. And they had. He finished the password. The vault opened with a low electronic chime. Inside were the final approved authorizations for the $5.9 billion Global Development Fund. His fund. The one he'd built from years of connections, sleepless negotiations, charm he'd taught himself to wield like armor. Funds from private partners, impact investors, and socially conscious capital pools he'd pulled together one deal at a time. Money the company assumed was already committed forever. Money he controlled. He opened the wire transfer interface. He heard Greg's voice in his head. "Because we don't trust you with adult money." He felt a snarl twist his lips as he began typing. He was deliberate, fingers moving with slow, careful precision. Account numbers, authentication codes. Every field he filled felt like a tiny act of revenge, a tiny cut on the smug faces around that table. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the silence of the lobby wrap around him. It felt thin, artificial. The world outside the glass doors buzzed with life, traffic, footsteps, murmured conversations. But here it was all hushed, civilized, a carefully curated lie. He realized he was still pressing his back so hard against the wall it hurt, like he was bracing for another blow. But the worst was over. The worst was behind that glass conference room door. And he had taken the one thing they hadn't expected him to find, the nerve to do what they thought he'd never dare. He exhaled again and forced himself to stand. His knees cracked as he straightened, the laptop bag hanging heavy in his hand. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder with a mechanical precision, eyes dull but determined. He could still hear Greg Denner's voice in his head, "Because we don't trust you with adult money." The words felt like acid on his tongue, burning, corroding everything in their path. He let the anger keep him warm. He let it give him the courage to take one slow step forward, then another, toward the hallway that led back to the boardroom. As he approached, he could hear something new on the other side of the door. The polite, smug laughter was gone. The calm assurance of people who had the world on a string had been replaced by something frantic, sharp, splintered. Voices were raised. Chairs scraped violently. Papers rustled. Someone swore loudly. He slowed his steps, tilting his head just slightly to listen. "Check again." Greg's voice cracked like a whip. "I'm telling you it's a glitch." "It's not a glitch," Marissa snapped back, her voice icy but thin with panic. "It's confirmed. Every cent is gone." "Impossible," Peter muttered, but even he sounded shaken. He didn't have the authority. He had the commitments, another voice said. "David Marks, the CEO, is normally calm, oily tone gone, replaced with something hoarse and raw. God damn it. He had the partners. They gave him sole discretion in the contract. It's legally binding." Ellis paused just short of the door, heart thumping like a drum. He let himself breathe in the chaos, absorb it like fuel. Inside the boardroom, the tension had thickened to choking levels. Greg slammed his palm on the table hard enough to make the water glasses jump. "Call legal." "I already did," Marissa hissed. "They're confirming it. It's real. The entire $5.9 billion is gone. Every partner signed off on his withdrawal authority. He sent them an email just now saying he's redirecting the funds." Peter cursed softly. David's voice was a growl now, filled with helpless fury. "That press release is live. We told investors we were reallocating it. We literally bragged about killing his project." Greg's face was red, veins bulging in his neck. "He doesn't get to do this. He doesn't get to humiliate us like this." Ellis closed his eyes for one heartbeat, then opened them and reached for the handle. He twisted it slowly, deliberately. The door swung open without a sound. For a moment, no one noticed. They were too busy screaming at each other, fingers jabbing at phones, laptops open and showing balance sheets, now bleeding red, where they'd once boasted black. The corporate safety blanket they'd wrapped themselves in had been ripped away, leaving them shivering in the raw cold of consequence. Ellis stood there, in his cheap khakis and sweat-stained shirt, the laptop bag hanging heavy at his side. He watched them, his face blank, but his eyes cold and clear. He could see Greg's expression as he turned and spotted him in the doorway. Shock, rage, a flash of something almost like fear before he covered it with a snarl. Ellis didn't flinch. Marissa's mouth actually dropped open slightly, the first time he'd ever seen her lose that carefully calibrated control. Peter blinked at him like he was a ghost. He'd pulled the plug. He'd watched their faces drain of blood as the emails poured in confirming the funds were gone. He'd seen Greg's rage curdle into something almost afraid. He delivered his quiet line, "I warned you not to bet against me," and he'd left them in their nest of paperwork and panic, knowing he'd never again be dismissed as the charity case or the mascot. But the truth was it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. He felt emptied out, scraped raw, his skin buzzing with leftover adrenaline. He didn't feel strong. He felt exhausted. He took one more breath and turned, starting down the crowded city street, boots scuffing the concrete, his shadow long and crooked in the neon glare of passing signs. He didn't look like the man who just yanked $5.9 billion out from under a Fortune 500 company. He looked like a man who'd been chewed up and spit out. But inside, under the bruises, something cold and hard remained. Something they hadn't broken. As night fell, the story broke. He sat in the corner of a dingy coffee shop, laptop perched on the wobbly table, watching news feeds update in real time. The headlines were everywhere. Historic $5.9 billion, funding lost Rock's major firm. Board in crisis after withdrawal by former partner. Reputation hit after development fund walks. Business channels ran it on loop, talking heads shaking their heads in mock solemnity, while the stock ticker along the bottom glowed an unrelenting red. Shares were in freefall, value cratering by the hour as investors stampeded out of the company they'd just the day before considered bulletproof. Ellis scrolled through social media feeds. The hashtags trended within minutes. Hashtag corporate arrogance. Hashtag funding fiasco. Hashtag Ellis Warren. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He watched the numbers plummet, reading the furious shareholder comments piling up on the company's official channels. He read statements of shock and condemnation from partner firms who hadn't known about the board's reprioritization plans. He watched video clips of analysts tearing apart the company's leadership in savage detail, describing them as out of touch, complacent, and grossly arrogant. He closed his laptop and sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. He felt the weight of it. Not just the money, but the truth behind it. They had underestimated him. They'd treated him like a joke. They'd stolen his work and thought he wouldn't dare fight back. He'd proven them wrong in the only language they respected: money, power, and public humiliation. But the fight wasn't over. Across town, the boardroom was chaos in a different form. The next morning brought shareholder meetings that no one could cancel. Cameras pointed at the executives as they tried to spin disaster into damage control. Greg Denner's face looked hollow in the bright lights, his tie crooked, the sheen of sweat on his forehead betraying his panic even as he tried to keep his voice steady. He blamed an unfortunate miscommunication, but the reporters weren't buying it. Marissa Taylor sat rigid beside him, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles gleamed, the polite corporate smile frozen like a mask about to crack. Peter Lang refused to speak, his eyes boring holes into the conference table, as if he could will himself invisible. But the worst was David Marks. The CEO had always been the picture of corporate calm: expensive suit, silver hair immaculately combed, voice smooth and measured even when delivering bad news. But on live TV, in front of furious investors and a half-dozen news crews, the calm was gone. His voice shook, his jaw trembled. He stammered when a shareholder demanded to know how he could let a single man walk off with nearly $6 billion. Ellis Warren sat in the back row of the dimly lit conference hall, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers interlaced loosely. The air smelled of stale coffee and printed programs, the hum of hushed conversations rising and falling in gentle waves beneath the formal keynote echoing off high ceilings. Spotlights bathed the stage in cold white light, illuminating speakers in sharp relief, men and women in press suits talking about sustainability, equitable investment, real development. It was a language Ellis understood intimately now, even more than before. Months had passed since he had watched their empire totter and fall under the weight of their arrogance. The images were still seared into his memory. The live broadcast of David Marks stammering, the chairman resigning in disgrace, the stock chart bleeding red like an open wound on every business network. But those were only the first days of consequences. In the weeks that followed, the company had bled talent, lost contracts, faced investigation for misleading investors. They tried spin, they tried blame, they tried begging. Nothing worked. Their reputation had cratered. And for Ellis, he had been busy, very busy. He had taken the $5.9 billion they'd mocked him over and done exactly what he'd promised. He'd sat across tables from skeptical partners, wearing his same plain clothes, and laid out the plan again, this time with no interruptions, no laughter, no Greg Denner rolling his eyes. And people listened. They didn't all say yes. Many didn't, but enough did. He built it piece by piece. Green energy in underserved regions, new infrastructure in small cities that had been written off, technology training centers in places the old company had called unviable markets. He held every partner to transparency. He showed them the numbers. He showed them dignity. He showed them what it meant to invest with integrity. He didn't get rich, but he got respect. He shifted in his seat as the speaker finished to polite applause. Around him, people stood to clap, some exchanging business cards, some excitedly making notes. Ellis simply sat there, letting the applause wash over him without rising. His eyes focused on the stage, but seeing something else entirely. He saw the boardroom again, the jeers, the scorn, the way they tried to erase him. He heard their words still sometimes in his dreams. Do you even know how to spell billion? But now it didn't make his fists clench in helpless rage. It made them clench with purpose. He heard his own voice over those memories. I warned you not to bet against me. As the room began to clear, he finally stood and stretched, gathering the old, battered laptop bag that had survived all of it. He walked toward the exit, head low, lost in thought. He didn't even see them at first. It wasn't until he heard his name that he stopped. Ellis. He turned. They were there. Not all of them, but enough. Greg Denner stood a half step behind Marissa Taylor, eyes downcast, fingers fiddling with the edge of his expensive watch in a way Ellis remembered all too well. Peter Lang was there too, older somehow, in only a few months, hair thinner, eyes ringed with dark exhaustion. Marissa was the one who had spoken, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it, the corporate gloss stripped away. Ellis, she repeated. Can we talk? He regarded them silently. He could see it all over them. The humility, the desperation, the knowledge of their failure. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He simply waited. Greg cleared his throat, voice hoarse. We're trying to pick up the pieces. The company is barely staying solvent. Investors don't trust us. They want to see something real, something with integrity. They said your name. They said if we worked with you. He trailed off, eyes refusing to meet Ellis's. Marissa stepped in carefully. We know we screwed up. Badly. We treated you like shit. We lost everything because we refused to see it. You were right. About the fund. About the vision. About all of it. She swallowed, voice trembling. We need your help. Ellis felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. He remembered every insult, every humiliating laugh, the way they told him to sit in the corner like a child. He remembered pushing past Greg in that boardroom, their jeers chasing him out. He remembered standing in the lobby afterward, fingers trembling so badly he could barely type his password, his tears staining the keyboard. He remembered sending the email that had flipped their world upside down. Fine, he said at last. Their faces relaxed, hope flashing like light in their eyes. But he lifted a hand. On one condition. Ellis let his voice sharpen, clear as crystal. cutting through the space between them. We do it my way. In writing, full transparency, full respect. My vision, not yours. No gutting it for short-term gains. No spin. We fund what matters. Or I walk. And this time you'll know I can. Marissa nodded immediately, eyes glistening. Yes. Peter gave a single, solemn dip of his head. Greg hesitated, but finally, he lowered his eyes and said, voice cracking, "Okay." Ellis let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He shouldered his bag and gestured with his chin. "Then let's talk." They turned and walked back toward the meeting room together, steps slow, but in unison, the polished floor reflecting them side by side. Ellis didn't smile, but his eyes were steady. He wasn't here to humiliate them. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here to make them do better, to make them see. And this time, they would listen. The end. If you enjoyed this story about justice, power, and redemption, make sure to like and subscribe to stay updated on future narratives. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this plot. What did you think about Ellis's journey and the way he turned the tables on those who tried to silence him? Was there a moment that stuck with you the most? Let me know in the comments. And while you're at it, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how many different places these stories reach. Let's talk about it below.